Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Gi Shin, Director of the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center and also Korea program at Stanford University. I hope that you are keeping well despite all the challenges that we face these days. As part of our fall seminar series, Shifting Geopolitics and U.S.-Asia Relations, so we devote our discussion today to assess the past 3.5 years of the U.S.-ROK relationship under the leadership of President Donald Trump and President Moon Jae-in. The two leaders have faced a number of flashpoints in their relationship over the years. In the beginning, they were quick to act together to bring the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un out of his hermit kingdom and put him on a path of summit diplomacy. At the same time, lingering issues such as military cost sharing, transfer of wartime operational control, and what South Korean stance should be in the midst of intensifying U.S.-China tensions have frustrated both sides. The current relationship in many ways mirrors the one between George W. Bush and Roh Moo-hyun from 2003 to 2008. The Bush-Roh period is often referred to as the most turbulent years in the history of U.S.-ROK relations, but it was also a very important period during which each side learned a great deal about the other side and moved the relationship to a new level. So I think today we can ask this question. Could the Moon-Trump era similarly be remembered as another productive transitional period in retrospect, or mark the beginning of the fundamental transformation of the alliance? Okay, no doubt that the upcoming election next week in the United States will have major implications for the Korean Peninsula, especially with regard to trajectory of U.S.-ROK relations. So whether there is a change in the leadership or not, today's assessment of the past 3.5 years of the U.S.-ROK relationship will provide a timely review for both sides to enhance their mutual understanding of what it takes to maintain an alliance relationship in today's rapidly changing political economic environment. So to do so, we have gathered an excellent panel of former officials and current foreign correspondents who covers both Koreas. So I'm very, very happy and honored to introduce our speakers to you today. First, Mark Lippert. He was U.S. ambassador to South Korea from 2014 to 2017. He previously held many positions in the Department of Defense, including as Chief of Staff to Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, and also as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia Pacific Security Affairs. And he was also in the military, in the Navy, serving as intelligence officer from 2009 to 2011. And I'm very proud to say that he is also a Stanford alum, and I'm sure he's very proud of having gone to the farm. Now he's working as YouTube's Asia Pacific Public Policy Chief. So welcome back, Mark. And our second speaker is Minister Myung Hwan, who was ROK's Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade from 2008 to 2010. Before that, Minister Yu was ambassador to Japan Israel, also ambassador for anti-terrorism and Afghanistan issues. So he had a really distinguished career in the government for almost 4 decades. And currently he's advising Kim and Jang, the largest law firm in Seoul. And also I'm very proud to say that he spent 1 year with us as a visiting fellow. Okay, last but not least, Laura Bicker, current BBC correspondent in Seoul. Ms. Bicker has been BBC correspondent for 2 decades, and she is now currently based in Seoul, where she reports on both North and South Korea. And this summer, we may remember her interview with President Moon Jae-in a couple of years ago. And she continues to cover the inter-Korean and U.S. North Korean summit. Before coming to Seoul, she was also based in Washington, and she followed Donald Trump election to the White House and his first years in office. So I'm sure she knows both Mr. Moon and Mr. Trump pretty well. Okay, so this is what we're gonna do today. First of all, each speaker will be making brief remarks. And then we will engage a conversation among us for about 30 minutes. And then we'll take questions from the audience. So please submit your question to this Q&A function in the Zoom. So without further ado, let me start with Ambassador Lippert.
All right, thanks, Professor Shin. Great to be back at the farm, albeit virtually. And I just wish I was there in person to get to the Stanford bookstore and get some more souvenirs that my wife says we don't need around the house. But anyway, that's mine to bear. Minister Yu, great to see you. Ms. Bicker, great to see you too. Really an all-star panel, and thanks for inviting me. I'll spend just about 5 minutes on the opening, and I won't tease out the very interesting thread you set up at the beginning, but I hope we get to it later, which is, Professor Shin, which you talked about in the Roh Moo-hyun President Bush era, that it was maybe a time of acrimony, but the two sides learned from each other. I would also argue seeds of some really productive policies were sown and ultimately reaped. The FTA, the 2005 joint statement, some of the basing and posture moves that were very productive in modernizing the defense part of the relationship. So that's also an interesting piece to that time as well. Won't go into it, but wanted to bookmark that there. What I would say is I'll just do a quick couple of minutes on where I think things stand today with the US-ROK relationship. And what I would say at the outset is, think back to 2016, 2017, all these calls of disaster or there's going to be a crisis in the alliance. It's interesting that despite all of those calls, the alliance continues to be fairly resilient. I would argue actually very resilient in 2020. The defense relationship providing effective deterrence against North Korea, commercial and economic integration increased under a revised Chorus FTA agreement, medical and scientific exchanges increased in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. People to people, I would argue, is closer than ever. And I'm a huge believer in this part of the relationship. The Korean film Parasite winning the Academy Award, K-pop band BTS toppling US Billboard charts, and ESPN broadcasting KBO almost daily. And those are very significant in democracies in bringing our two peoples together and providing space and a foundation for the alliance. Having said all that, I would say that there is an argument that the alliance has not entirely fulfilled its vast potential. I think analysts would argue that it could and should be doing more. And what they often point to is that governments in Washington and Seoul have gotten too focused on a narrow set of issues, some of them quite tactical. Lots of time and energy focused on defense burden sharing, unilateral 232 trade actions, the machinations or lack thereof with a single bilateral working group on North Korea, and North Korea policy itself, which is not tactical, but a lot of focus has gone into that. And the result is what my colleague at CSIS calls an upside down pyramid. Victor Cha has said that before, with, again, a disproportionate amount placed on a small set of often thorny issues. And the issue with this isn't that we can resolve these, of course. We've done it time and time again. The issue, I think, is more the opportunity cost, right? We've got a range of geopolitical and economic issues facing the alliance. COVID-19, we've got a China piece, frictions between Tokyo and Seoul, demographics, challenge to the rules-based international system. All of that is extant in this landscape, and that demands a high-performing alliance. The good news, as I said, is that we've done this before. We've worked through thorny issues, and I think it's fairly easy to right size this right side, and expand this upside down pyramid. What I would do is just 3 quick things to try to basically front foot the alliance, reduce the irritants, find common ground, effectively manage the legitimate disagreements such as burden sharing, OPCON, as Professor Shin mentioned at the outset, trade actions, things like that. Second, aggressively engage in traditional alliance issues, security and economics being at the fore, and that essentially going into some of the underserved areas while adapting, updating, and modernizing alliance thinking and mechanisms. And finally, broaden the aperture. Broaden the aperture to cement progress and or push into what I would call the new frontiers or newer frontiers: cyberspace, fourth industrial revolution, public health, energy, and the environment. And as I said, look, we've done this before. It won't be without obstacles, but there are lots of reasons for optimism, including a strong cadre of alliance managers on both sides of the Pacific, significant progress in a number of areas during the last several years that can quickly be built upon. And finally, I would say, not insignificantly, the goodwill and space provided by the democratic the 2 populations in democracies. Support is still quite high for the alliance. So with that, look forward to a good discussion, and I'll turn it back to Professor Shin.
Okay, so now let me turn to Minister Yu from Seoul.
Well, good afternoon, Professor Ki-Wook Shin and Ambassador Mark Lippert and Ms. Laura Bicker. My special thanks go to Professor Ki-Wook for his a wonderful idea of convening a virtual seminar. Considering recent unprecedented tensions of Sino-US relations, which have huge implications on South Korea's diplomacy, it is a timely topic to discuss the importance of alliance between the United States and ROK. As you know well, in recent weeks, a lot of anecdotal comments about the alliance relationship are coming from both Seoul and Washington that are basically alarming and somewhat irritating. For example, the Ministerial Security Consultative Meeting recently held in Washington allegedly failed to iron out the discrepancy on key issues such as burden sharing, OPCON transfer, and commitment on American troop level in South Korea. But these are all, I think, a tactical issue, as Ambassador Lippert mentioned just before. But there are far more important strategic issues for the alliance, such as quadrilateral meeting, and Quad Plus, or EPN and clean network regarding 5G and Huawei. Someone told me that the resilience of alliance is now being tested by a new wave of thinking, both in Seoul and Washington. It is difficult to deny that Korea's perception regarding the military alliance with the United States has been diversified. I want to say diversified, even ever since Korea achieved economic development as well as democratic political system, together with generational demographic changes. And this tendency was reinforced by rise of China and China's growing economic and social influence over Korea. China is now Korea's #1 trading partner, and Korea's trade volume with China exceeded $250 billion. That is bigger than Korea's trade with the United States and Japan combined. And China is also #1 tourist origin as well as destination for Korea. Korea has been sensitive for the Chinese strategic interest and tried not to provoke China's security concern. For example, way back in 1990s, Kim Dae-jung administration decided not to formally join the U.S. missile defense program. And that policy was maintained during conservative governments as well. And more recently, Korea has been reluctant to join Quad or Quad Plus and clean network against China. And some diplomatic pundits even say that South Korea is taking so-called strategic ambiguity toward big power rivalry. However, I believe a vast majority of Korean people understand that the security and prosperity in the region cannot be guaranteed without strong bond of alliance with the United States. A recent survey conducted by CSIS, a Washington-based think tank, showed that only 4% in South Korea supported China, and 17% are in favor of neutrality between the United States and China. The remaining 79% are in strong support of U.S. Korea alliance relationship. The other big challenge for the alliance is North Korea. The threat perception in Seoul regarding the nuclear weapon program of North Korea seems to be not quite the same with the United States in recent years. President Trump's top-down summit diplomacy with Chairman Kim failed to produce a concrete progress toward denuclearization. And President Moon was very much disappointed by the stalled U.S.-North Korea negotiations. While the North Korean issue is a diplomatic issue for President Trump, it is a domestic, political, and also ideological issue for President Moon, who has been placing a priority on inter-Korean reconciliation. President Moon would like to jumpstart dialogue with Chairman Kim by proposing the formal declaration of the end of the Korean War. However, the US is maintaining a position that inter-Korean reconciliation should go hand in hand with the progress on denuclearization and also in harmony with the US-North Korean relations. In conclusion, I believe that the overall alliance relationship between the US and ROK is strong enough to overcome current difficulties. However, there has been some sort of complacency on the part of South Korea in maintaining the alliance relationship. Korea has to bear its share of burden to keep the alliance healthy and resilient and sustainable. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Yu. So let me now turn to Ms. Bicker.
Hello there, thank you so much for having me, and great to hear the comments so far. What I have done is read a lot of headlines over the last few weeks, which seem to suggest that the alliance is in crisis. As you've heard there, I don't think that the alliance is in crisis, but I do think if it was a marriage, it needs to go for some serious counseling. And I think for three kind of main reasons. First of all, I would call it the Trump effect. And one of the reasons why it's kind of difficult to even compare this current position, diplomatic position, to previous positions and previous eras is because we have a very unconventional US president. It is not a president that you can deal with in a conventional manner. Now, his bellicose rhetoric from the rally pulpit make amazing headlines, great sound bites, and really fire up his base. But when it comes to those delicate diplomatic discussions, well, it's like a blunt instrument that can sometimes rip the heart out of any delicate need for discussion. So I think that's been a real problem. And it's not just been a problem for the diplomats behind the scenes, it's a problem because it generates headlines in South Korea. I mean, think of all those fire and fury statements. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself. Well, that didn't just affect North Korea. If there was a war, it would really kind of wipe out a lot of South Korea too. And the likes of Lindsey Graham did not help. Senator Lindsey Graham said that lives would be lost over there if there was a war. Now, these are headlines that continually generated on Yonhap, on state media, on all sorts of media here, which make South Koreans feel that not only are they a junior partner, they're not cared about at all by the US alliance. So when it comes to what needs to be done in counselling, that, whether it's the next Trump administration or a Biden administration, that will be something that needs to be ironed out. And yes, you mentioned that overwhelmingly, the South Korean people want a US alliance. Donald Trump's approval ratings sometimes here, especially when he met Kim Jong-un, soared. So there is still a need for the US alliance, but there's also a need to be careful about how we talk about that alliance. President Moon has also made a few missteps of his own, perhaps overselling what both North Korea and the United States were willing to do during those negotiations. And for that, he was cut out by both countries when they met. Secondly, I think the second point is money, money, money. It's come down to those defense burden sharing discussions. When it comes down to it, it does seem, certainly when it's narrowed down to the headlines that people read, that the US is thinking only of the dollar sign rather than what the alliance might mean to them. And if you read the book Rage by Bob Woodward, it seems that General Mattis, when Donald Trump visited Seoul, was at pains to point out exactly what South Korea was doing here and also how much the alliance would mean. But in those discussions, it seems that nothing has been sorted out. It's obviously a priority for the State Department. I heard the Deputy Secretary of State, Stephen Biegun, saying it was something that needed to be sorted out urgently. So they do know that it's there. But it's not just about cost between the alliance. The money, money, money part also refers to what this alliance might cost South Korea in the future if, for instance, it decides to join Quad. And now we've just heard it mentioned there, but when it comes to kind of this alliance between India, Japan, Australia, and the United States to try to counter the rising dominance of China, we all here on the peninsula remember the cost of THAAD. 40% of tourism was lost here of Chinese tourists. Overwhelmingly, as you heard, the trade partner is China. So that brings us to the third thing that South Korea and the US need to think about when it comes to this alliance, and that is the great power struggle. We are entering this era of the great power struggle. We are seeing the rising dominance of China. Now, I've just seen the Moon Chang-in's comments this morning, President Moon's former or current advisor, saying that joining Quad would be the existential dilemma for South Korea when it comes to this alliance, because as I've just mentioned, obviously it would come at some kind of a cost. It's going to have to be a serious discussion. Now, they're saying right now that the US hasn't asked Seoul to join. I wonder whether that shows that Washington is sensitive to South Korea's problems and issues on this. However, when it comes to countering the rising dominance of China, South Korea is caught in the middle, not only because of its relationship or would-be relationship with North Korea, but also because of its trade relationship. So now it's caught with this strategic alliance with the United States and its economic relationship with China. And that's something certainly that this alliance is going to have to deal with in not just the coming years, but in the coming months. I would end with saying that personally, when it comes to having worked in both countries over the last 5 years, that there is a lot that both could learn from one another. It's very interesting coming from Washington, DC to Seoul and seeing the different perspectives in different cities. And I came at such a strange time. It was the early 2018, just as Kim Jong-un had decided to talk to the world and certainly join into the Winter Olympics. So I think perspective-wise, perhaps it would be useful for more discussions between the higher level officials and lower level officials. And I'm sure both ministers and the ambassador will tell me that does go on. But it seems that there is a perspective shift. And the coronavirus pandemic is one area, for instance, whereas when you watch South Korea suppress the curve and produce a handbook, then you realize that this country is not just an ally to talk with about national security. It's an ally that you can learn a lot from. And back to you.
Okay, thank you so much for making very stimulating remarks, and I think we have a lot of issues to cover. But let's just start with South Korean position in the middle of competition tension between two big powers, U.S. and China. As a minister, you mentioned, South Korea kind of maintains strategic ambiguity. They are trying to avoid a situation where they have to pick one or the other. But now I think it's becoming more and more difficult. Now even economic issues are now becoming linked to national security. For example, Huawei is a big example, right? So now, not only government but also Korean companies are struggling to decide, what to do. Okay, so in the current situation, then what Korea, should do or can do? I mean, should they continue to take strategic ambiguity, or just, what Korea should do? I mean, in this current situation, and because this U.S.-China rivalry is not going to disappear. It might rather intensify, so that it's a problem that Korea has to deal with. So, what's your view on this big question?
Well, it's as Laura Bicker quoted Professor Moon saying that that is a somewhat existential dilemma. As I said earlier, Korea heavily depends on China in terms of trade. And also at the same time, Korea is almost totally dependent on the United States in its security. So Korea cannot choose either one easily. So all depends upon what will happen in the United States next week. Even though there will not be much change on US-China policy, but well, to some degree, if Biden is elected, if there are some way out to elevate this kind of, tensions between the United States and China. But fundamentally, we have to think about what is the value Korea is, taking care of. China is still, ideologically a little bit different from us, even though we are dependent on China for trade, but it's not that important compared to fundamental value of humankind and the security. So as I quoted earlier of the CSIS survey, that a majority of Korean people, if the moment truth is coming to South Korea, we have to take side with the United States for its security and for its value. But I don't think it's at the moment we have to say clearly we are taking side with the United States or taking side with China. So this kind of strategic ambiguity policy will have to continue for some time.
Ambassador?
It's a good question. I guess what I would say is, Minister, you cited the CSIS report, which I thought was very, I think, well done and indicative of at least elite thinking or foreign policy expert thinking in South Korea, right? That was the representative sample in that study. I think what I would say is I think a strong alliance is critical with respect to the geopolitical situation in Northeast Asia. Because I think, as the CSIS study said, you're just better off with it than without it. You're stronger together, right? It's a very basic principle. So strong alliance, critical. The second piece, which you've already seen the Moon administration undertake, is diversification, right? Both in terms of economic dependence on China, by diversification into Southeast Asia. I think nicely followed or led by, depending on which order you want to, when you want to start the clock, a deliberate foreign policy strategy aimed at Southeast Asia, headed up by Im Sung-nam, who's a very senior diplomat in Jakarta. And finally, I think the final prong that you're seeing is, of course, on these issues that are tough, you're seeing lots of engagement by South Korean diplomats in both capitals. So I view it as less of a hedge, more of a strong alliance with a diversification piece and efforts to keep lines of communication open, and where possible, either minimize or otherwise remain out of zero-sum choices. That's where I see the strategy, and in a way that doesn't differ a lot from the conservative approach under Park Geun-hye. You're seeing a lot of alliance emphasis, but you also remember that Park Geun-hye early in her tenure made a very strong push towards better relations with China, and was successful in getting Xi Jinping, I think for the first time in recent memory, to have a Chinese leader visit Seoul before Pyongyang. So this is not necessarily something that is unique to the current landscape, but I do think is something that as Minister Yu said, we're going to be dealing with for years to come, given the complexities of Northeast Asia, and I'll stop there.
Okay, so going back to Laura's point about Quad meeting. Okay, US, Japan, Australia, India were getting together without South Korea. I mean, is there any, does it have some significant meaning, or what should it make of that?
Well, I think when it comes to those four getting together, I found it quite interesting reading Professor Moon's comments, because he said that Seoul had not been asked to join this alliance. What I made from that when I read it was, perhaps Washington knows that by asking Seoul to join, first of all, it would be difficult to refuse, and second of all, it would put them in a difficult position, which suggests that Washington is more sensitive to Seoul's needs than perhaps many feel when it comes to this alliance. However, it is, as Professor Moon puts it, perhaps an existential dilemma for Korea. I think what we'll say is probably a mix of the approaches you've just heard. I think South Korea will continue this balancing act. Yes, it is has always been a problem. I remember interviewing Foreign Minister Kang and saying, what is it like being on this peninsula in the middle of this, geopolitical dilemma? And she gave me a wry smile. She says, well, it's always been South Korea's burden to bear. And when it comes to it, yes, it always has been, but the current power struggle is greater. I mean, look what happened after the Hong Kong national security law was put in. China was hit by sanctions by both the US and the EU. It simply shrugged them off, because as an economic power, it is growing. And after the coronavirus pandemic, it will, starts to play out, and we see how the economies of different countries fare. China's certainly managing to come out of it pretty well. So I think that it will become a bigger crisis to deal with over the coming years, even more so than now. And when it comes to Quad, I think South Korea may have to figure out where it sits in that, and whether or not it's an advisory role, or whether, certainly South Korea has the capacity to help with intelligence gathering, whether it's, kind of a side role. All of these things will have to be discussed, and certainly depending on who is in the White House, that could make it even more of an issue, because if Donald Trump is still president, the rhetoric against China is likely to continue. It's unknown exactly what a Biden administration would do with China at this point.
So, Minister Yu, let me ask you this question. You became the first foreign minister, under Myung government that came after Roh Moo-hyun administration. And certainly there's a lot of concerns and talks about the future of alliance. So if you compare today to that time, when you came to office as foreign minister, how do you compare? They are very different, or there's some similar?
Well, if I recall, Roh Moo-hyun government way back in 2003 and 2007, Roh Moo-hyun government was very much pragmatic. You may remember that Roh Moo-hyun want to be very much, independent from outside influence in his, decision making for security issues. But he participated in Iraq war, and also he decided to push through Korea-US FTA, despite the objections from his people surrounding him. So I think in diplomacy, especially South Korean diplomacy, we need some kind of pragmatism. But this government, I feel that is a bit more ideological, is less pragmatic than the Roh Moo-hyun government.
Okay, so I think that leads to a different question, which is about more internal challenge. And we talked about external challenge like U.S.-China tension, its impact on the alliance. But what about internal issue? Laura mentioned about Trump just talking about money, right? But also, I think I feel like in both sides, alliance issue has become politicized, and like in Korea, Minister, you mentioned that now the ruling elites are quite ideological. So there's political polarization on a number of issues. So how do those internal politics affect the U.S.-ROK relationship now and in the future?
Well, Kyuk, you may remember the old saying that diplomacy is an extension of domestic politics. Bipartisan diplomacy in principle is a good guideline, but it is very difficult to put into practice. As you know, South Korea now is pretty much polarized according to ideology, preventing any consensus on either diplomacy or North Korea policy. So it's a big hurdle, big conundrum to resolve among ourselves. There is no way to resolve this by outside, influence. So it's our own issue, our own problems. But as I said earlier, that there are some kind of, Trump risk in managing Korean alliance with the United States. As Laura Bicker said, Trump's behavior is a bit erratic. So, but that's why many people in South Korea is carefully watching what will happen next week in the United States.
So Mark, any thoughts on this question about internal politics?
I wouldn't pretend to start to prognosticate about South Korean domestic politics from the United States. I defer to Minister Yu and to Laura, but what I would say is I do think that if Vice President Biden is elected next week, I do think that there is a resilient base of popular support for the alliance, right? Poll after poll in South Korea shows that the alliance, you can argue, has come a long way in the past 20 years, right? There is a strong foundation of public support. And when you lay on top of that, more classic policymaking and an emphasis on allies, both in the Pacific, Atlantic, and around the world, I think you have the makings of more political space. Let's put it that way, for policymaking on both sides of the Pacific. So, I think that's the key, right? That there are some frictions, but the frictions, I think, with skillful and again, more traditional alliance management can be surmounted and turned into a very, very vibrant global alliance that does great things around the world. I'll end on this. I tend to be an optimist on this. I tend to, seeing the ups and downs, seeing the cadre, seeing the support among the two peoples for this, I tend to think the structural elements are there for a strong future.
So Laura, anything to add?
Internally, I think if, and I'll be honest, I think if any administration here in Seoul was to lean towards China rather than the US alliance, I think we'd see mass protests in the streets. I think for those who have never been to Seoul, if anyone's listening to this who is trying to understand internal South Korean democracy, this is a vibrant, rowdy democracy. They take their right to vote, they take their right to protest extremely seriously. Saturdays here are a cacophony of sound pre-COVID, obviously, when people could gather. And I think if there was a leaning towards China rather than the US alliance, we would see a lot more people out on those streets. I don't think they would tolerate, and I think we've seen that in poll after poll, any kind of leaning towards China over the United States. And it's great to hear the optimism from both our speakers about the future of the alliance. And as I've said before, I think it needs counselling. It's not in crisis, but certainly perhaps there is room for manoeuvre and there is room for talks.
Okay, so now let me turn to a question about North Korea policy. Maybe until last year, there was some maybe optimism or expectation that there could be some breakthrough regarding North Korean nuclear and other issues. But then since what happened in Hanoi last year, we are kind of in stalemate. So where do US and ROK stand now regarding North Korean policy? Still, are they still on the same page, or now they are having different views and policies? What's your assessment right now?
Well, let me say this. If Biden wins the election, he will prefer so-called bottom-up approach. But on the contrary, this government want to see a bit more drastic approach to resolve the nuclear problem. President Trump met 3 times with Kim Jong-un, even though he failed to produce any concrete result. But there is some kind of atmosphere that we can resolve this nuclear conundrum through a dialogue. Of course, a sanction against North Korea is an important tool to bring Chairman Kim to a negotiation table, but sanction alone cannot resolve the problem. But as long as two allies have share the same threat perception toward Kim Jong-un's nuclear programs, Seoul and Washington can have a little bit different approach as long as they share the same goal. Some suggested a division of labor, each playing a bad cop or a good cop role according to circumstances. And let me tell this: the inter-Korean relationship is unique in many ways because of historical and cultural background. The U.S. government is expected to understand the political aspiration of any president in South Korea, whether it's conservative, liberal, and they want to leave a legacy of inter-Korean reconciliation. But as I said, as long as we have the same goal, I don't think there will be still, I can say we are on the same page.
Okay, Mark or Laura?
Laura, go ahead, please.
First of all, I think that Biden certainly hasn't said that he won't talk to Kim Jong-un. He said he wanted preconditions. So there is room for maneuver there. I think if Donald Trump wins another term, we will see perhaps more meetings with Kim Jong-un. I think North Korea is probably watching all of this carefully. We've seen the unveiling of that so-called, as one analyst described it, monster missile, this very large ICBM. But I think if everybody was focusing on that, there were other things in North Korea's 10-10 parade that many should have raised eyebrows at, and that there were around 80% of the weapons, armory, tanks on display were either new or modified, according to analysts. So that should give Washington and officials here in Seoul something to think about. Despite all the strategies, despite the summits, the handshakes, the photo ops, the sanctions, nothing appears to be slowing down their development of nuclear weapons. Now, there is a feeling here in South Korea that these top level meetings, these meetings do have an effect. But certainly when it comes to it, there needs to be more of a setup. Most of it felt like a photo op, having been there, rather than anything of substance. And I think that's what's lacking. Perhaps Joe Biden could be persuaded, if he wins, to meet with Kim Jong-un initially and then work on whatever kind of strategy they need to do. When Donald Trump first took office, I remember that initial conversation that was leaked to us, that President Obama had told him that the biggest priority was North Korea. Well, I wonder 4 years on, if that handover conversation, if there is one, or if Donald Trump is sitting there wondering what his next 4 years will bring, North Korea will remain a priority. And the situation has not been solved. It does need dealing with, but it's a case of which camp and which strategy to use. And I do wonder whether the Biden camp are now beginning to listen to advisors who perhaps with new thinking, with new ideas, and include South Korea in that thinking, because they've dealt with it for the last 70 years.
Yeah, just one piece to add here. I do think that we tend to put too much weight on what the United States will do, and, you know, to a lesser extent, the South Korean piece. And, you know, I used to get this a lot in terms of, well, if the US just prioritized this, or we just took this approach, or this. The issue here to me is that the North Koreans have a very substantial vote in all of this. And I think that there's a couple of really open questions going in to next year. And first, I think it's, you know, what will, if there is a Biden election, what will they do between now and inauguration or early in the term, right? And we've seen, you can argue, some analysts argue restraint up to now, but will there be some sort of provocation to send a message? And does that send everybody cascading into a spiral that will then take time to resuscitate, find the right interlocutor, move forward there? I think that's one piece. The second piece that I would say, it's still not clear to me how much the North Koreans really want to engage in this inter-Korean channel, and how much they want things like the end of war declaration and all of that, right? That seems to be coming a lot more out of the South. Understandably so. Right. Their priority seems much more on sanctions relief, right? And that brings me to the kind of the third point. You know, there is this moment in the Bolton book where you get Kim Jong-un and President Trump in the room. And, you know, for years, analysts would say, if you just got the two leaders together, the North Korean leader would be able to have some flexibility, and the president could show some flexibility, and you could really make some progress. It was interesting because that didn't happen this time. And, you know, was that a lack of creative policymaking on the North Korean side? Was it a negotiating tactic? You know, Chun Yong, I think, is quoted in, you know, the South Korean National Security Advisor is quoted in the Bolton book as saying, I was surprised that there was no deal reached there. It was very interesting. So I think there's that piece. And then finally, it's the calculation in terms of how much does the North Korean regime needs sanctions relief and other relief from hard currency deprivation. You've seen, really three things hit them quite hard this year: natural disasters, the sanctions that for the first time starting in 16 are broad sectoral-wide sanctions, right, as opposed to piecemeal WMD sanctions that existed in the years before that. So you have these handful of very tough sanctions, and then finally COVID, which had a downturn on the trade with China and caused the North Korean regime to really reduce or otherwise shut down some of these informal markets that were coping mechanisms. So that piece of the North Korean calculation, I think, is also very important. So I think it would, in sum, I think it's just very important as we're thinking through how the U.S. ROK alliance works together on this, which I think is a very constructive point. And usually people go the other way, they go right to North Korea. It's also really important to bring the North Korea piece forward as well.
I mean, I was going to add to this. I mean, from my information that we're able to get out, I mean, it's with very few eyes and ears in North Korea right now. But our information is that it's pretty dire. The situation right now in North Korea is pretty dire. And the second point is, again, and maybe the others can elaborate on this, when it came to the deal in Hanoi and the discussions in Hanoi, the two sides did come close.
Right.
It wasn't a huge failure. They did come close, but they were just asking far too much of one another. And I wonder whether lessons have been learned on both sides about not just how to deal with one another, but also what to ask of one another. So I don't think the summits were perhaps the failure that they appear. There is perhaps room for maneuver there. And as Ambassador Lippert points out, that the North Koreans, if the situation is at that dire, they do need sanctions relief. He has promised his people for the last 6 years that they will have economic prosperity. He is a young leader. At some point, he needs to start delivering on his promises, and that needs sanctions relief. So I do believe that perhaps North Korea is looking for a way out. It's just perhaps what is offered to them and when it's offered.
Let me add one more point to what Laura said. Yes, the economic situation in North Korea is very dire, very difficult, because three reasons. One is a tight sanction regime, and second is COVID-19, and thirdly is natural disaster. But China is always providing a lot of help. Not only food, but some fuels and coking coals. So there's a lifeline upon which Kim Jong-un can rely on. So as long as China consider North Korea as its buffer zone in fighting against the United States, it's not that easy to resolve nuclear issues through sanction only. That's what I said, sanction only cannot resolve this conundrum. So we have to bring China into our effort to persuade Kim Jong-un to give up a nuclear program. So China's factor is very important.
Yeah, one point, I think, Minister, you makes a great point, just the role of the Chinese, which, 3 years ago was so paramount, right? It's kind of faded into the background these days. We don't talk enough about it. I think that's just an excellent point. The other thing I would add, it's interesting too, and this is not my observation. In fact, most of them aren't my observation. I just parrot off of others. And so we're in an academic setting, so I'm trying to cite others. And what I would say is, what was interesting was when the summitry was going on, you noticed that the Chinese bracketed each summit with their own summits. And that one brings in the China piece, but it also gets the North Koreans back to their game of playing the Chinese off of one another. It used to be the Soviets, now it's the Americans. And I think that's helpful. So I do think that there is still an element where the North Koreans don't want to be, they want to hedge in their foreign policy. And so that can be drawn out to Laura's point and to Minister Yu's point of bringing the Chinese into this is important but it also, I think, doesn't completely discount the North Koreans' motivations to try to diversify their diplomatic space and relationships.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me ask the final question, which is assuming that Biden wins election next week, okay, and then he will be very busy in dealing with domestic issues, COVID-19, the economy, racial tensions, and all kinds of problems, right? But then, North Korea may want it to, or is likely to, test new administration, by testing, ICBM or whatever, right? And then, once again, Biden administration may be occupied with domestic issues. So some people are a little concerned about, about the situation that U.S. may not be able to pay full attention to North Korean issue, but North Korea, is trying to test the administration. And then, do you think maybe South Korea should play a certain role, maybe like in the next first half of next year? What do you think? I mean, that's maybe one area that some people are concerned.
North Korea's, strategy regarding nuclear issues always aiming at the United States. They wouldn't talk to South Korea on the security or nuclear issue with the South Korean government. But what this government, Moon Jae-in government, want to say is that opening the dialogue is important. Whether North Korea want to deal directly with the United States or not, we believe it's an issue between North and South Korea, even though North Korea wouldn't agree with that. But that's a dilemma for us. Even though we continue to call for a dialogue in North Korea, I think Kim Jong-un wouldn't respond to it, especially next week, because next year is in South Korea. Everybody is focused on the presidential election the following year, 2022 May is another presidential election. So next year in South Korea, all the focus will be on who will become the next president of South Korea. So Kim Jong-un wouldn't respond to our call for dialogue. So that's a big question what will happen next year. If North Korea tested another ICBM or another nuclear device, it's a disaster. Between North and South Korean reconciliation process, and also it will create a tension between United States and North Korea as well. So I don't know whether Kim Jong-un will really taking that kind of risk because sanction regime will be tightened. Also, China will respond in a bit negative way because China basically doesn't want to see a small neighboring countries can have working level kind of a nuclear weapon station near the border. So it's a big dilemma for China as well if North Korea tests another nuclear device or ICBM.
Any comment from either of you? Or?
I think when it comes to whether or not Biden's going to be too busy to deal with North Korea has over the years proved very effective at getting the world's attention if it wants to. It will be making calculations as to whether it wants to, but if certainly they do want to be dealt with, they've certainly made it clear in the past when they want the world's attention. I think second of all, I think Minister Yu is potentially right when it comes to North Korea not wanting to speak to the South. They've already blown up the Inter-Korean Liaison Office. I think it became clear once President Trump and Kim Jong-un met in Hanoi, it did seem that Seoul was sidelined. All the promises that President Moon had made to North Korea about restarting the Kaesong industrial complex, restarting tourism, building a railway, all of these things were not in South Korea's power to give without asking for sanctions relief from others. So I think what the North has realised is it needs to deal directly with the United States, and that is perhaps the legacy of the meetings with President Trump. They've realised that they can get a meeting with the US if they make enough noise about it. And I think also whether or not will they have a test? Will they have a test? Well, my guess would be yes, but who knows? We'll need to wait and see what they test as well, because short range ballistic missile tests so far have just raised eyebrows from the US.
So Mark, any comments or no?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is first, I mean, my own personal view is I'm incredibly pragmatic on this. So whatever works, I'm for that. And I think that's where I come at this. And I think, after decades of this, we all need to be as pragmatic as possible. So I guess what I would say to that end, it dovetails with both the previous comments. The North doesn't really seem all that interested in the inter-Korean peace right now. They seem interested in a U.S. Bilateral conversation. It doesn't mean, though, and that brings me to my third point, that you can't be in tight alignment with the South Koreans. You can encourage and very much try to help support inter-Korean talks if there's interest there. It does take two to tango. So you've got to get that. I think there can be strong support and calibration on what that would look like. If it were me, I like the more you can get the people-to-people contact, those types of projects versus big infrastructure. I tend to like those. And then on the U.S. North Korea bilateral piece, it doesn't mean the South Koreans can't be intimately involved in that planning as well. Even if the North wants to go bilateral with the U.S., there could be a deliberate decision by the alliance under emphasis on deliberate decision to say, okay, let's try this with strong consultation and preparation up front, strong consultation coming out of the meetings. And I think finally, the preparation point, which I think dovetails with what Laura said earlier, and I also think Minister Yu as well, is that in this go round, maybe one of the elements that was missing in the last couple of years with summits and high level is the prep work. So bottom up, I'm not a big believer that you have to have every I dotted and every T crossed before you get to the leaders. Leaders are important. They're incredibly consequential, but there's a happy medium. Creative policymaking leaders with some good solid prep work worked in together. And then I'll stop here, but how that's all sequenced, which leaders meet with who, is it a ministerial level, trilateral, do we go, bring the Chinese six-party talk? That all, I think, starts with the alliance consultation. And then you grow that out from there, and I'll stop there.
Okay, so I combined many questions from the audience into my question, but let me ask the final question, which is some people saying that Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un enhanced Kim's status in the international community. So can you expect that might change his behavior in the coming years? That's the final question to any of you.
Well, I believe to some extent that's right. Somebody criticized that Trump made Kim Jong-un the focus of international media, but I think it may work. In the past, all of the North Korean leaders were trying to, propagandize himself or the nation to the world. So we have to make North Korea responsible in international, community. For that, to some extent, we have to let Kim Jong-un coming out to the world, community. So we may have to invite him to come to the United Nations General Assembly so that he can learn what's going on outside his own country. Even though when he was young, he was educated in Switzerland, but it's not enough for him. So he have to see himself what happened outside North Korea. It's really a cocoon-like society. So first of all, Kim Jong-un himself should be internationalized to some extent. So it's not that bad that President Trump made him a focus of international media. I don't know how Laura is thinking about that.
Laura, Mark?
Being
final
the
thought,
media. Yeah, being the media. is it bad? Is it good? He was the focus. They met. The agreement didn't happen. You know, is it bad? Is it good? I think the only thing I would say as a correspondent is, you know, we cover what we see, and I think a lot of the arguments were that the meetings legitimized the North Korean leader. It also brings into sharp focus what's going on in his country. And although nobody kind of asked him outright about human rights, it certainly was in a lot of the column inches. And as a correspondent, I've interviewed maybe 105 North Korean defectors since I've arrived. And I think a lot of attention is paid to the leader of North Korea. A lot of attention is paid to his missiles. I think anything that draws attention to what might be going on within the country, it should be welcomed. There is a mass abuse of human rights. Some of the stories I've heard would really kind of curl your hair. It's just awful in many respects. There's a lot of hunger going on. There are thousands of people in prisons undergoing hard labor for, you know, the very small thing of crime, of perhaps trying to watch a South Korean drama. All of these things got attention in the media that perhaps would not have had these meetings not taken place. So that's something else that you kind of need to take into account.
Okay, Ambassador has final word.
I guess what I would say, you know, first I would just really thank Laura for raising the humanitarian and human rights issues, because I think it's a really important topic. Obviously, it wasn't paramount here today. We were talking about other things, so I think that's incredibly important. Just a note there. You know, on that question, I guess what I would say is, I think it did open up the diplomatic space for the North Koreans. Probably bought more time, took some pressure off. I tend to be of the view that, you know, my pragmatic side of me says, you know, you need some pressure, and then you need a clear, well thought through, coordinated diplomatic off ramp, right? That's been, I think, I think that gives you the best chance of success on a really tough problem. And I think, you know, you inadvertently upset that balance by either moving up to the summit too quick, as Minister Yu knows, you've got to carefully calibrate that, and or alleviating some of the drivers to make the summit as productive as possible. And I think that's the balance that we have got to think through as an alliance going forward on what is that calibration, what's the level, and what are the fundamental drivers that will achieve our shared goal of moving forward on denuclearization, the WMD programs, and ultimately, you know, I think restarting inter-Korean talks to augment that process. And I'll end it there.
Okay, thank you so much. I wish we could continue, but I think we have to end given our time. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for stimulating conversation. And I hope that we can convene again, maybe early next year, maybe when new administration comes into office, and then we can continue our conversation. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and then have a great evening. Thank you.